And I just saw these pictures on television on these riots in Dresden when the trains were passing through. And I thought to myself, if I'm in a situation like that and I'm wearing this uniform and I have a gun in my hand, nobody on the other side is going to see or care that I'm this, well-read, caring person, that I actually went to these underground concerts and such. All they're going to see is a guy in a uniform with a gun.
This is Cold War Conversations. If you're new here, you've come to the right place to listen to first-hand Cold War history accounts. Do make sure you follow us in your podcast app or join our emailing list at coldwarconversations.com. In this riveting account, Tilo recounts his experiences as an East German soldier during the final months of East Germany. He details the rising political awareness among soldiers, his fear that his unit will be asked to shoot on demonstrators. He also provides a personal perspective on the pivotal moments leading up to and following the fall of the Berlin Wall, including attending massive protests and his first visit to West Berlin. Spurred by a broadcasted precedent of concession to striking soldiers in another barracks, Tilo and his comrades orchestrated what can only be described as a mutiny, a demand for their rights, dignity and acknowledgement of the transformative tide sweeping across East Germany. The fall of the Berlin Wall is often recounted in grand narratives of geopolitical shifts, but regular Cold War Conversations listeners will know that it is stories like Tilo's that remind us that behind monumental changes are individuals and communities. I'm delighted to welcome Tilo back to our Cold War conversation. April 89, East Germany has in inverted commas, election. May 89. Were you able to vote in that?
Oh, Ian, of course I was. Luckily, I mean, there was this fetish of high attendance at elections, and of course, everybody had to vote yes, but that was not enough. It had to be 100% attendance, and that was not enough either. You had to have 100% attendance like 2 hours after the polls opened. There was this ridiculous competition of party bureaucrats of sorts. And our army unit, the whole barracks, I'm guessing 1,400 people, and there were 2 other units. We had our own voting precinct, the voting district rather, so we didn't have to leave to vote. We could just vote in our cozy barracks. And of course, there was a lot of pressure that you had to vote by such and such time. And in the actual voting room, there was like this big bin where you could put your vote. And then there was off in the sides, there were these little cabins. But the way it was set up in East Germany was that you were supposedly just to fold your ballot and then stuff it into the box. If you even went into a booth and started marking things, then that would already make you suspect. And so, I towed the line, I went there, I got the ballot, I stuffed it in, and I went away feeling a little bit dirty inside. But there were a bunch of officers in that room kind of watching the proceedings, because obviously nobody knows everybody in such a large unit. So each battalion, each subunit sent an officer there for the express purpose that they could identify people. And I had a mate in this staff battery. He was a kind of a rebel rouser and a poet. And, I had spent some time with him in Schwerin in his student digs, and a guy who, whenever possible, he whips out a guitar and sings a song and so forth. He was cool.
Was he good with Billy Bragg?
That wasn't his style. He was a little bit older, but still, yeah. Okay. So, but he had made it known that he was not going to vote, or if he was forced to vote, then he would just vote no. He would just cross out everybody, soil the statistics, And what happened was that he was given special leave. He could go home. So he was, in a way, rewarded for being a nonconformist, which I thought was brilliant. Yeah, just goes to show what a stupid theater the whole thing was. Yeah, as long as we have 100% attendance in our regiment, then
Now, did the ballot paper have some of these puppet?
No, that was not how it was organized. There was just one party of sorts, and in these elections there were separate parties. That is true, but you couldn't vote for, say, your NDPD over your SED or whatever. There was this block of unity, and they just fielded candidates. And the candidates were chosen from these different parties by somebody, I don't know. And you either voted for the whole block, and the only way to be against it was to cross out each and every single candidate. And that was how it worked at that time. But this was a significant election, of course, because that was the first time that across East Germany, many people took it upon themselves to record how many people actually had not voted and to prove that, to collect their voting cards and so forth, and then do a tally and compare that against the officially published results, which were fake, right? I mean, they still had a solid majority, if you can call it that, but it wasn't 99%, and maybe it was 93% or whatever. And so it was clear evidence of fraud. Yeah.
That's where some of the protests that ended up with the opening of the Berlin Wall. I mean, it'd been known for years that the vote was faked, but this was like hard evidence.
Exactly. It was so plain to see that the emperor had no clothes, right? People had collected these voting cards, which you had to turn in at the voting station to be given a ballot. And they had pinned them up against the wall and taken photographs and recorded that, yes, actually, in this district alone in this room, there were, I don't know, 170 cards up on that wall. And according to official records, perfect attendance except for 67 people or whatever, So clearly that's not right.
Yeah. So how much are you aware that unrest is starting to build in East Germany?
Right. So, I mean, I was aware, but mainly due to sometimes listening to radio, because we were not supposed to have private radios, let alone television sets. It was all in barracks. It was all these little, like, fixed installations, as it were, which you could just choose between 4 different East German radio stations. But I was home, I was much more lucky than most of the other soldiers, and that I could, through my privileged job and position, be home in Berlin, say every 3 weeks or so, or even every 2 weeks. And that was my main communications then, to be able to watch West German television or to talk to people and things, And then in the summer of 89, I mean, forget politics and democracy and all that, but just so many people were leaving through Hungary and through the Czech Republic and just getting out, and everybody knew someone. And that was a reality which even the diehard party guys couldn't close their eyes anymore, And still the official propaganda there was this famous article supposedly written by Honecker himself saying, "Wir weinen ihnen keine Träne nach." We don't shed a single tear for these traitors who have left their socialist mother country. Good riddance, right? And this sort of, if you might still, be a good socialist, but man, you miss your daughter and you're never going to see her again because she's a traitor now and she's in West Germany. And that sort of thing, I think the whole push to leave East Germany and to be stopped from doing so, or maybe not, that was really the straw that broke the camel's back. And that was very, very visible over the summer, with what was going on in Hungary. And then in the early fall, it kind of came to a climax of sorts, because then people could leave from Prague, from the embassy there. There were some riots and things. And then we were put on heightened alert, as were other units. So we couldn't leave the barracks anymore. And people were moved to, officers had to be in at all hours, and there were checks at the gun rooms and whatnot. And that really worried me, because like this border guard situation, it's bad enough if it's happening, but do you want to be the one who's pulling the trigger? And I was acutely aware of that, we had gone practice shooting, for instance, right? You're just being put on a truck. Everybody has their AK-47, or later on we got the newer AK-74. I was a pretty good shot. And you just put on a gun on a truck, and driven somewhere, and then you're coming out of the truck and there your targets, off you go. And I just saw these pictures on television on these riots in Dresden when the trains were passing through. And I thought to myself, if I'm in a situation like that and I'm wearing this uniform and I have a gun in my hand, nobody on the other side is going to see or care that I'm this, well-read, caring person, that I'm actually went to these underground concerts and such. All they're going to see is a guy in a uniform with a gun. And likewise, this is going to be a crisis situation. The officer behind me, if you run away in a situation like that, then there's no telling what's going to happen. So it just felt very bad. And I just felt like not only was I in a bad time, but that I had somehow, through no fault of my own, maybe going to be on the wrong side of it, because once people are throwing rocks or Molotov cocktails and there's some close fighting in streets and whatnot, it's too late. You have to pull out before that, right? So, and then after the Prague embassy had been emptied by letting these people go to West Germany, then the border to the Czech Republic was closed. So to the west, forget about it. To the east, Poland already closed since 82. And now the last escape valve has been closed off. And I remember sitting in this workshop with these two friends and just drinking and joking about how they only have to construct a roof on top of us to make it fully airtight, right? Germany is such a small country. Yeah, so that's how it felt. And at the same time, our unit was going to be the artillery complement to the parade on the 7th of October for the 40th anniversary of East Germany. As it was, you can still watch that reel on YouTube, the whole parade. And there are my guys, right, with their guns and on the tow trucks.
Were you on that parade yourself, or was it?
No, fortunately not. Fortunately not, because it was all just such a stupid thing. No, I was supposed to help out with some graphical thing, because I could draft and make plans and such. So I was commanded to be somewhere else. But they had these big Tatra trucks, again, 3 axles, which they were pulling the artillery pieces with. And normally one gun crew is maybe, I don't know, I'm thinking 8 people or something. But for the parade, they would take the top of the back of the truck and they would put in these benches and they would fill these trucks to the brim with soldiers because it looks prettier that way. And so maybe they had 20 soldiers back there. Their helmets shining like they were polished with butter, and just for show, to pull the piece, and these soldiers sitting rigidly up. And they made them practice beforehand because it's not an easy task to sit totally upright and rigid and not move a muscle, looking straight ahead for hours on end, because that's what they were asked to do in sort of the forming area, and then to go in and pass Honecker and all of that, right? So like little Prussian puppets. And to make sure that people could do that they were hardy enough and stoic, all of the soldiers who participated in that parade, they took their little stool or whatever, right, their little seat, took it to the parade ground, and then formed mock complements of the trucks without trucks, just on the grounds, sitting themselves down in the exact same order, exact position, facing each other on the parade ground, and then just sit there for hours, sit there with officers prancing about and telling them, don't move, sit up straight. It's like, I watched this from the window of my room and I was like, goodness gracious, I'm so glad that I'm not a part of this. So.
I can imagine. Did you ever participate in any of the demonstrations?
I did, actually. I did participate in some of the key demonstrations, always on leave, right? But yeah, I participated in the big demonstration. It's known in the records, I guess, as the Alexanderplatz demonstration in East Berlin on November 4, so a couple of days before the wall opened. Of course, we didn't know that, right? That was going to happen. And that was wonderful. That was a wonderful experience. I don't know how many people we were. 200, 300, 400,000, I don't know. I mean, East Berlin had 1.2 million or something. But it was clear that this was it. This was the population at large. And I went there with a friend and we just walked on the street, and then there were ever more people. And on the side of the street, underneath the awnings, Karl-Liebknecht-Straße, there were these young guys with crew cuts and anoraks and mumbling into their hidden radios. And it was clear that these were like Stasi troopers or whatever, And in the olden days, that would have been ground for concern, to put it mildly. But now it just suddenly felt like this is it. These guys should be worried about their future, because I'm not afraid. The people here are not afraid. Back there, we're not afraid, and we are hundreds of thousands, and this is it, right? So, I mean, in hindsight, it is so fortuitous, so lucky that it all ended in, or happened, moved forward in such a peaceful way. But at that time, I just was not afraid anymore. Just all this concern, oh, if I'm gonna do this, will I still be able to go to university? Will I have to work as a gardener on a cemetery or whatever? That was always the backup plan. Non-conforming oppositional figure, work as a gardener for the church. Who cares? Because the whole charade is just tumbling down, and suddenly it was apparent to everybody to see that these guys are nothing to be afraid of, and not only that, but they're ugly. Their clothes look like shit. Their anoraks have ugly colors, and they're stupid. It was like a turn of the key, if you will.
Yeah, almost like a light had been turned on.
Yeah, for sure. You look around you, and you're like,
Yeah.
oh goodness, I'm not the only one. I'm actually, yeah.
Yeah. Did your parents go on these demonstrations?
When I came home for that weekend to participate in that demonstration, they were busy in the corridor of their flat, which was quite small, standard, and they were painting banners for that, or placards or something, that some politician, I don't know, Krenz, or it wasn't Krenz, it was somebody else, but doesn't know, that they should resign, that they should resign. But the next morning, that person had already resigned. So events were moving briskly along. They didn't take that banner because it was already outdated.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Even East German TV was reporting some of this stuff, weren't they? At this point?
They were, yeah. For some, East German TV was kind of waking up, and I think some of the journalists were, whether they were showing their true selves or just prepping themselves for the future, I don't know. But yeah, suddenly East German television was playing a part. Actually, without East German television, the whole strike mutiny thing wouldn't have happened, I think, because that was just under the radar otherwise.
Yeah. We'll come to that in a moment. I just want to ask you, and this is always one of my favorite questions, where were you when the Berlin Wall opens? What are you doing? How do you hear about it?
Right. So I was sleeping through it, basically. I had a long day in barracks, and I was tucked into my bed with my standard issue bedding, these little white and blue boxes or pattern,
Mm-hmm.
and I didn't realize what was going on. It was late at night, and it was only the next morning I got up. I went to the bathroom, and as I was dragging my feet past the corporal who was on duty, he knew that I was from Berlin. So he said, like, hey, Tilo, you're from Berlin, right? And I said, like, yeah. He's like, well, you know what? Last night, the wall's been opened, and it stayed like that. So the wall's open, no more wall. And I said, yeah, sure. And I went on to take a shower because I thought he was taking the piss,
Yeah.
But I came back, and then everybody was so buzzing about it, on the radio and whatnot. And then I said, like, yeah, you may have a point there. Yeah. So, but I didn't have leave for that weekend, so I just stayed in barracks. And on the Monday morning, the soldiers who had gone to leave, they'd all gone to the west, and they had brought back newspapers like Bild Zeitung or whatever. And I still remember these newspaper pages from Bild Zeitung flapping and scattering over the parade ground. What an unusual sight.
Almost like a prophecy of what was going to come.
Yeah, but also because to be in the possession of a West German newspaper in barracks would have been a serious offense before, it would have been, so.
Yeah. It's incredible, that period, because it's like the government and the army has almost been like a paper tiger, because it just sort of just disappear. That whole legitimacy disappears.
That's true. But I think it's the backing of the Soviets, which was obviously and for everyone to see was gone. And what was happening in Poland, what was happening in Hungary, I think enough people, even the apparatchiks, they saw the writing on the wall, and maybe they didn't see unification. I think no one saw at the time, but at least they realized that what they're going to do now, maybe they're going to be in court for that in some time, That's my interpretation, at least. But it was also just everything was happening so quickly. Orders from the top were not coming because Honecker was ill, and there was discontent and just discussions in the Politburo, and nobody wanted to take drastic initiative, and it was just all sort of, everything was too slow for the events, basically.
Yeah,
Luckily.
Paralysis at
Yeah.
the top. So when is the first time that you visit the West? And
Yeah,
are there any sort of like bureaucratic hoops you have to go through?
Yeah, that's so, it just goes to show how German I am, I guess, or most people are in Germany. Big surprise there. Okay, so in the first days of the wall being open, people were just streaming through and there was no problem there. But pretty soon you had to at least show some kind of identification. And once you got drafted into the army, you relinquished your personal ID card. You didn't have your civilian ID card or passport anymore. You had to give that up, and you were given an army ID in turn. And your passport, and if you had one, and your civilian ID card were kept in your local police district. And there was a process for getting that in case you wanted to travel to, I don't know, Hungary on your leave or whatever. But it was not very frequent, of course. But I thought, I want to do this right. I want to go home to Berlin and then want to go to West Berlin, of course. I better make sure that I have this ID card. I was also worried that because I had this high security clearance, that normally you couldn't go to West Germany for 5 years at least after leaving the army. All these thoughts were going through my mind. I wasn't picturing the situation on the ground in Berlin, but I thought, I better, tick all the boxes here. So I dug out this form, which had to be signed by the commander of the unit so that I could get my passport. And so I could have gotten to the chief of staff. He wasn't there, but I just met the commander, the brigade commander. He was on the general track, he had gone to the military academy in the Soviet Union and all that. I respected him. He was a smart guy, but like a 200% communist. And I just kind of passed him on and said oh, comrade, Lieutenant Colonel, would you mind signing this for me because the chief of staff isn't here? And then he looked at it and he said okay, so you too want to go to the West now? And then I said yes, sir. My grandparents are living in West Berlin. I would very much like to visit them, And he said well, that's this sudden rush to the borders to crawl to the West. It shows a lack of dignity, doesn't it? So he was criticizing me of sorts, all the development. So, but I said, yeah, maybe so. But on the other hand, I think it's also lacking some dignity to not let a grandson visit their grandparents when they're living in the same city. And he just kind of just scoffed at that,
Wow.
And he signed the chit. So
those guys, the believers in true and existing socialism, their whole world was crumbling before their eyes.
Yeah, for sure.
So
I don't know.
What are your first impressions of West Berlin?
It was just one evening. So, you build up this picture of a place, even if you have television for 19 years, and then you're there. And it was really weird. It was cold, of course. It was November, and all these bright lights. I went over Potsdamer Platz, the crossing. Nowadays it's all built up, but at the time it was just this big expanse of just empty ground, this no man's land basically, and they had made a sort of a improvised crossing point there. And yeah, I just showed my passport, my ID or whatever. I went over there with a friend, and we trudged over this no man's land, which was quite muddy because the trucks for the border guards run parallel to the border, not perpendicular. And I just suddenly realized that this is it. This is happening. This is a spot where, just a year ago, I would have been shot if I would be here, right? Or maybe arrested. But we just went through it, and that's it. You're there on the other side. And we had to cross the street to get to a bus stop because I had this city map, this Falk plan, this folding plan. Maybe some listeners may not realize this, but in East Germany, we did not have any maps of the immediate surroundings of the border. It was all white. It was blanked out in the maps. So your regular East German city map of East Berlin would just have East Berlin, and then there would be the border and then white. So, but luckily, I had a city map of Berlin, which my father had given to me, which he had used as a student from 1960, 60. It was still, partially valid, I
Yeah.
would say.
Yeah.
So I kind of knew my way. Of course, GPS wasn't there yet. And then we had to cross the street, Verbindungsstraße, east of the Tiergarten. And we got almost run over because these cars were coming at us, and we just judged the distance and ran over. And then we realized now we better start sprinting because these West German cars, they are so fast and they have less noise, So that was right. Yeah, took the
That's
bus.
a really interesting detail. That so you were used to crossing a road with the speed of a Trabant or a Volt.
Yeah, and the noise, right? So
and the Porsche and the BMW moved a
not
bit
sure
quicker.
about the Porsches, but a Volkswagen Passat would have done it, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we just, luckily the West Berlin Senate had made it so that everything, public transport, even some concerts and stuff, were free if you were from the East. So you could just show your ID card, and that's that. Because I didn't have any West German money on me, would have been difficult anyhow. And we visited my grandparents for the first time.
Just seeing them in their own home in West Berlin.
I mean, my granddad, the pastor, is a fairly reserved guy. He doesn't. Also, he had other visitors before. All the East German relatives had just come flooding in, but it was very emotional. I mean, make no bones about it. He poured us a cognac, which wasn't his normal style, but I think it was to celebrate the occasion.
Yeah. Wow. So you return to East Germany and you return to your barracks. I mean,
yeah, that is the crazy thing. In hindsight, I could have just called it a day. I could have just what, this is not my scene. I'm staying home. But reunification, or that was all. Nobody was even discussing it. It was all just changing from week to week, and the feeling back then was, well, if I'm just gonna not return to barracks, then I'm gonna be a deserter, and I'm not gonna be shot, but that's a crime, officially a crime, and it's gonna be a black mark on my records. And I've gone through so much already, and I've kind of arranged myself there. So, let's not rock the boat now. And most people thought like that. I mean, many people also just went to the West, but in the barracks, most soldiers just came back to their duty stations, and just, of course, talked smack and were more free in how they expressed themselves. But by and large, rules were followed. And that was a problem after some time, right? Because nothing changed. Training went on like that. We still saluted all the officers with Genosse such and such, comrade such and such, And it all become quite pointless, because with all this stuff going on around us, what are we even training for? What are we preparing for? Why do we have to be in barracks all the time over the weekend when our West German comrades in arms, as it were, are always going home for the weekend? What's this all about, right? So this started bubbling up and simmering, and I was, of course, busy going home for the weekends as I could, and go to rock concerts in West Berlin and whatnot. So it didn't bother me so much, but it felt very much like a charade after a couple of weeks. And then what happened was that on the night of New Year's night, the evening prior, there was a strike in a regiment in Belitz where soldiers weren't let go I mean, they hadn't concluded their army service, but basically they were told that they should work as substitute workers in a lignite plant or power plant or whatever, right? Because workers were always short. And that was the sort of the convenient plug, was to use some units and to plug those holes, make them work. And usually that was soldiers like that, they were like, the saying was always, unit such and such is in der Volkswirtschaft. They're in the economy. And that meant that you didn't have to wear uniform, maybe for half a year, maybe for 3 months. And the companies where you were at, they were all state-owned, of course, the enterprises. They would treat you nicely. Maybe you could interact with some women and so forth, So it was a much better gig than being in barracks. But this had all turned now because people were like, what? I'm going to do what? So there was a walkout in Belitz. And as you mentioned earlier, East German news media had kind of woken up and they covered this. There was a segment on this youth television which had covered this walkout where the Minister of Defense, the newly minted Minister of Defense, had come down to talk to these soldiers and in the end had reached a compromise that they were, yes, they still had to work and yes, they still had to be soldiers, but they could work in their former places of employ. In other words, their service had ended. And this was like a bomb, I mean, if this is what it takes, you just walk out of your barracks and then the minister comes down and lets you go. Cool. So I was home over the New Year. I was at this gigantic party at the Brandenburg Gate, which was fantastic. And then I came back to the barracks and I walked through the checkpoint and this guy who knew me, he said like, hey, Tilo, what's up? Today's going to be interesting because we're striking. And I said, what? Yeah, we're striking. Just go to your staff battery, you will see. So I went there and there was a big commotion and everybody was talking and milling around. And it just, I don't know how it happened because I came from my leave. But everybody knew, everybody was on board. We are done. We're not going to go through this anymore. We're not going to go on exercises. We're not going to go on parades. We're not going to clean any guns. In fact, we're not going to leave the houses anymore. Full stop. And this is it. Strike. And yeah, so we got together in this little, like not all of us, of course, but like subunit by subunit. And in this battery of mine, this staff battery, we started discussing, and yeah, we're striking, but what are we actually striking for? What's the goal here? And then we started discussing that. And being the young guy with the glasses, let's not mince words, the nerd, right? Being the nerd, I started writing down stuff. And when somebody shouted out something, and I said, like, look, it's okay, Martin or whoever, that's already here. I've taken that down. Any other ideas, right? And so it was a mix, right? The main thing was that we demanded an immediate reduction in service time from 18 months to 12 months to 1 year, just like in West Germany. So that was always also kind of a model, like with the weekend leave, that was always sort of like, well, they have it in the Bundeswehr. Why can't we have it too? And that people wanted to go home for each weekend. Yeah, fair enough. And a bunch of other stuff. We also asked for, that was actually my idea, was to ask for an actual non-military service like they had in West Germany instead of the Bausoldaten. But also some political stuff, like we had to address officers as comrades such and such, and they would address us likewise. And we didn't want that anymore. We felt that what's the party got to do with it? So please, talk to me, Herr Gefreiter for you, not Genosse Gefreiter. The organization of the party should also leave the barracks because that was centered around the army organization. And right. So I wrote that all down, and then we met with the other guys who had done likewise in the other subunits, the other batteries and battalions and such. And we met in the regimental club and compared notes. And basically, I ended up compiling the joint list just by, I don't know, by volunteering, by being good words, whatever, right? And then there were two other units there. One was an anti-tank unit, and the other was like a rocket, like a Stalin organ, these
rocket artillery.
Rocket artillery, right?
Yeah.
So we were three, and they gave us this job basically to negotiate. And since I was from the most numerous unit, the artillery brigade easily had like, I don't know, 2/3 of the people there. And they said, okay, well, you're going to be Regimentssprecher. So that was my role, speaker for the regiment.
Big responsibility.
Yeah, for sure. It was, it all happened so fast, right? I didn't think it through, but it just sort of like, here's a job and I think I can do this. Let's move this forward, right? And then we met with our commanding officer, who I knew quite well from the regiment, and they also had someone come down the next morning from Militärbezeug, from corps level. And they sat down with us, and there was no negotiation really. We just read through the demands and we just explained them, and they were like, "Oh, that's interesting, but we have to take this up with the higher command. Meanwhile, stay calm, make sure there's no violence." But we didn't have a general in our barracks. That lieutenant colonel was the highest rank we had among the officers, and suddenly there was this 2-star who was sitting opposite me, and I was a private first class, 19 years
and you're
old.
telling him how it's going to be.
Well, I don't know how it was going to be, but I was just laying down, making the arguments and saying, here's what's happening, they're behind the times, and let's be reasonable here.
Yeah.
No one's going to attack us, so why do they keep us in the barracks? And here are the demands and so forth,
Were you worried that they would take a very dim view of that and arrest you all, or not?
Not really, but it was more because of my inexperience, I think. I just, at the time, there was such a positive momentum with the wall open and everything that I didn't really think about the downturn. They were, for sure, After half a day, they had sent around junior officers to collect the keys for the gun rooms, because those were on the floor, so you could just go up to the corporal, and if you so wanted, you could get your gun, right? But they wanted that to be a little bit harder. And afterwards, a couple of days later, I paged back in the diary of the commander because I was busy there. I was just curious what was going on there. And he had written that the batteries, or like company commanders, were supposed to join the man and identify the instigators, report back. Yeah, and sure enough, in hindsight, at the second meeting, the battery commander, a seasoned captain, bit of a drinking problem, but all right, and he had joined the guys in the club, and he said, like, hey, would you mind? I'm, willing to learn. What are your concerns, etc. But sent a bit of a chill down my spine. But thankfully, I mean, the only point that this really came home to me was actually in the summer of 91, when there was this coup attempt in Moscow with Yeltsin on the tank and Gorbachev deposed and all that. And I thought, yeah, if this would have happened in December or January, I don't think NATO would have done anything. I would have been legging it to the West German border and hoping that there would still be some way to cross it, right?
In some ways, it was echoing the workers' councils that were formed at the end of World War One, which very
Absolutely.
German history.
Yeah, consciously so. Actually, we called ourselves Soldatenrat Dabe in a conscious attempt to, paint ourselves in that tradition, which was always held high for sure. We sent our proclamation to the Schweriner Volkszeitung, which was the regional newspaper, by a rider with a motorcycle, and I still have that. I sent it to you actually, the article cut out, because we wanted to be sort of visible in that sense, because we didn't quite know what was going to go.
Yeah. I'll be sharing the extra information Tilo sent me in the episode notes. How long does it take for that change that you're looking for to happen?
About 4 hours, I think. So, so seriously, it was 4 hours between that meeting in the morning with the guy from the Militärbezirk, the general, and then in the middle of the day, we had this bunker with these secure communications and things. And then there was this telex, a long telex, saying, here are the reforms, the immediate measures, blah, blah, blah. And yeah, so yes, it was Herr Soldier from there on. And yes, service was reduced to 12 months or 24 months for the corporals. Since I was already at 14 and a half months, I wasn't let go immediately, but I think like in the middle or at the end of January, I'm hazy, but something like that. Yeah, and that was it, because I think it was the end of January actually, because most, if not all, of the instigators, as our commanding officer put it, were actually guys like me in their third term. They were private first class because you knew the ropes, you were the most connected and so forth. And since we were all going to go home in a few days, it all just kind of steam went out, basically. Actually, the Stasi, which had their own complement in the army itself, sort of disguised as army officers, Department 2000, there were 3 guys when they were kicked out, basically, because suddenly the army brass discovered that they were not so fond of the Stasi. They wanted to, push them aside, distance themselves. That's when our commanding officer actually asked us, the Soldiers' Council, to be witness to them cleaning out the offices of the Stasi to, spread the good word or whatever. So that was interesting. But there was nothing in there, They had cleaned out all the files.
Yeah. Wow. And you leave the army at the end of January 1990.
Yeah, that's right.
What sort of happens to you then?
Well, I didn't study psychology, and I didn't want to go to East German University because I felt, in hindsight, very good perception that was going to be 2 or 3 years of lost time, of reorganization and chaos and so forth. So I enrolled at a university in West Berlin, and I went to America and went to grad school there and worked some.
Wow.
So I had perfect timing for me, I would say.
An incredible story. Really appreciate you sharing that with me. Fascinating details there.
Thank you very much, and really enjoy your show. And I'm looking forward to sharing this with my kids, actually, because some stuff, you never talk about it, maybe, or it's just the time, and maybe they don't care. But it's a podcast, so they can either listen to it or not. And so I'm looking forward to discussions afterwards, maybe.
Don't miss the episode extras such as videos, photos, and other content. Just look for the link in the podcast information. The podcast wouldn't exist without the generous support of our financial supporters, and I'd like to thank one and all of them for keeping the podcast on the road. The Cold War conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thanks very much for listening, and see you next week.